which is Jeff Becker. And a little bit about Jeff before he fully takes over here with my virtual mic. Jeff is the Director of Corporate Learning Solutions at American Management Association. He has over 20 years of experience in leadership development, coaching, and corporate education. Jeff has worked in HR operations, sales, where he consulted and developed executive to mid-level management, and frontline associates. And Jeff is going to be talking to us today about the human side of change management, which I'm very excited about. So Jeff, I'm going to hand the mic over to you and have you take it away.
Great. Thank you, Charlene. First and foremost, we'll do a little sound check here. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great. Yes.
Okay, super. And I am going to share my screen. So we'll make sure that that is all working right now. And we'll go full screen. How's that?
And full screen. You're ready to go.
All right. Excellent. Very good. You got to like when the technology side works. Okay. Charlene, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And Richard, whoops, I'm going a slide too fast. There we go. Richard, I think, set us up for success in terms of talking about kind of the future and what's happening and learning and development. We're going to switch gears a little bit here, but actually it plays right into this and talk about this human side of change management and what is it and how does it work and what do we need to be thinking about in regard to the people side of change. So we'll spend a good focus there for the next 30 minutes or so. And what I'd ask for you to think about, and really kind of my purpose for you today or the next half hour, is to think about what are 2 or 3 things you can put in place around change management and really around, again, the human side of change management. What would help your organization? What might help you? So there might be some tips, some tricks, some ideas for you individually, as well as your team, your organization, and the things that you're going to be doing over the course of the next few months and frankly years when it comes to change. So with that in mind, I want to back up for just a moment, and at the risk of sounding a bit like a commercial, but just to give ourselves some credential in terms of who are we and who is AMA. I work for an organization called American Management Association. Let me slow down there. We've been in business for just about 100 years, and our focus, as you see here, is really globally working on talent development, talent management, and people, and helping them perform better. Ultimately, that is our goal. It's something that gets me up every morning. It's something that our team is very focused on, but that ability to help people perform at their best. So I just give you that as a quick overview of who we are and really where does this information and this research that you're about to see, where does it all come from? So with that in mind, what's our agenda look like? I'm going to back up in just a few minutes and just talk about what is change management. Let's put some definition around it. What is it? How do we define it? How does it come to life? The second thing we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about the change management process. It's something we've been utilizing at AMA, for about 2 years or so, and it's really helped organizations to think not only about the business side of change, but the people side of change. Thus, our third bullet point, how do we align it? How do we align what we're doing with change management and link it to people? Okay, so 3 kind of simple things, but we'll dive into each one of those a little bit further. I mentioned backing up first. When I start to think about change management, I like words, I like definitions, I like to give something kind of a framework of what the heck is it? And so to give us a definition and framework around change management, I'll start with the top piece here. When I first looked up change management, this is frankly what I found. A systematic approach to dealing with the transition or transformation of an organization's goals, processes, and technologies. Now, folks, there's not a human component in there. That is all business related. Goals, processes, organizations, administrative things. How do we do stuff? How do we get things done? So a lot of change management is often focused on the business side. Not that that's not important. It's absolutely critical. But to take it a step further and think, okay, well, what's the purpose behind it? The purpose of change management is to implement strategies for affecting change, controlling change, which I think is actually quite a phrase. Can you imagine if we could really control change? None of us would be on this in this summit. We'd be doing other roles if we could really control change. But I think it's an interesting play on words. And then the last piece, helping people to adapt to change. That's the most critical piece here. Helping people, again, focusing on the people side, the human side of a business change. Richard mentioned a lot of things happening in terms of the future. We mentioned COVID and all that, all that has changed because of that. This is relevant to, could be that type of change. We're hearing a lot more now about people going back to work, and am I going to be in the office? Am I going to be at home? Are some people going to be here, there, and everywhere type of thing? Plenty of changes. So you can apply this to just about any change that your organization is going through. But again, we're asking you to back up a little bit and just think about what's the human component when it comes to change. One of the things we talk about a lot with our clients is what's your readiness for change? So this first slide really focuses on you, whether you are lead a team, whether you're an individual contributor, whether you're a senior level manager, it's all relevant. But we ask you to step back and say, let me do a little assessment of my change readiness. And really ask you to think about two words. And I'll start at the top here in terms of, react versus respond. Two words to think about. How do you react or respond to change from a people side? I'll give you a kind of a definition of both of these. React tends to be a bit more emotional, a bit not necessarily thought through, a bit quicker. Respond is a little bit more mindful, a bit more controlled sometimes, and thoughtful around what kind of comes out of us, if you will. We all have different emotions to change, particularly depending on how it impacts us. But asking ourselves to think about how do I react to change, or how do I respond to change? What is my own individual assessment of how ready am I for a change? So some things to think about underneath there. There's the technical side, certainly sort of the business side, if you will, but there's this emotional component to change as well. I've got to be thinking about both as a leader, as an individual contributor, as a senior manager, whatever level it might be for you, your department, your organization. I've got to think about both of those. The second one, foster open communication. I won't spend a whole lot of time here because it's a key component of our change management process, but it's absolutely critical. The third one, I've got to engage employees in solutions. Now, I don't want to set up the false hope that you're always able to implement all of their solution, but engage them. At a minimum, keep them up to date on what's happening in terms of the change or the solution. Again, we'll dive a lot deeper into that one. And lastly, don't wait for perfection. We hear more and more in clients that we're working with, like, hey, well, I'll let everybody know how we're doing when it's all done. No. Celebrate interim successes. Let people know, hey, we've met this part, we've met this goal, we've met this milestone along the way. Don't wait until it's finished or completed. If that's the case around COVID, we're going to be waiting a long time. None of us really know when it's over or done, or when the changes around it will really be finished. So think about celebrating interim success along with that change. Again, so a little change readiness. And again, as much as I'm applying this to ourselves individually, you can certainly apply this to your team, allowing them to get a little bit of an assessment of where are they when change happens and occurs? How do they react, or how do they respond? So a bit of a play on words, but again, something to think about in terms of our reactions to change. Emotional intelligence. So before I go into the change model, I always have to back up on emotional intelligence. It comes up regularly with our clients. There's a strong emotional intelligence quotient, if you will, wrapped into change management. And so again, I want to kind of give you a definition here, and I'm going to stop along the way and point through some of these, some of these words on here. First and foremost, the ability to identify and manage your own emotions. I'm going to stop right there. Emotional intelligence, a lot of times we'll ask people about emotional intelligence and how it relates to them and other people. And oftentimes people think it's either somebody else, hey, somebody else needs to think about emotional intelligence, or they think it's just themselves. The first piece here of the definition talks about the ability to identify and manage your own emotions, in this case, to change. The second piece, to observe and influence others' emotional states. So there's an egocentric component to emotional intelligence. There's also an allocentric component to emotional intelligence. The reason we talk about that in a change management process, again, is you've got to know where you are. There's got to be some self-awareness from a people standpoint around how am I dealing with this change, and how does it come through in terms of my emotional intelligence. It also has to go the other way to say, am I connecting, as we see the second part of the definition there, to others, and connecting to where they are from an emotional standpoint regarding the change. So I always have to kind of lay that groundwork from an emotional intelligence standpoint, because it overlays change management and how effective we may or may not be on that human side. So I've mentioned a few times the change management process. So let's dive into this one, and I'll give you kind of just a quicker overview of this, and then we'll dive into each one of these individually. I'll start in the upper right-hand side there on the orange side. First and foremost, I got to understand the change drivers. What is this change all about? What's happening with it? I need to understand that. Secondly, moving down to the pink section, understand the barriers to acceptance. People will have a tough time accepting it. It is just human behavior. But how can I alleviate some of those barriers? So I first understand what some of those barriers are to people accepting it. Again, we'll talk more detail on that one. Moving down, third, communicate the change. Absolutely critical. I won't say much now because I've got a whole slide on that one. It's absolutely critical to think about how we communicate that change. Moving to the left, to the blue, the lower left, manage resistance. It's not control resistance. It's not eliminate resistance. I've got to help manage resistance. We'll talk more specifically about that one. I then need to think about commitment and buy-in from the team. Big difference between commitment and compliance. We'll talk about that, but how do I get some buy-in from the team around this change management process in whatever form it's coming through? And then lastly, and probably the one that's oftentimes forgotten, is I've got to evaluate the impact. Oftentimes and I say we organizationally, we do this, I do this, we have a lot of clients that do this. We forget to continue the loop in terms of letting people know, did the change work? Did it have the effect we wanted it to? What was the impact? What happened internally? What happened externally? How did it impact our customers? How did it impact our buyers? How did it impact our partners? But evaluating the impact. Oftentimes we see that it stops before that. So thinking about how do you finish the loop in evaluating the impact of change management. Okay, so let's get a little bit deeper into each one of these here. And I'm going to kind of flip through my notes, make sure that I'm keeping up with myself, if you will. First and foremost, the orange section, okay? Understanding the change drivers. Now, one of the things we hear regularly is that organizations tend to focus on what we're doing. So what's the change? This is the change we're doing. And when we're doing it by. But here's the critical piece that we see missed regularly. There's oftentimes that the why is not there. We don't communicate the why are we doing this change. Talk about what, here's what we're doing with the change, and it's going to happen by third quarter. Okay, great. Hey, why are we doing this? People need to know that. So we've got to understand the intent, the outcomes of the change. What are we trying to do? We also have to understand who's impacted. Is workflow impacted? Roles, responsibilities, skills, knowledge, capabilities, who does what? Communication paths as well. So thinking about what's the impact of that change, internally, externally, partners, clients, you name it. Okay, so that's the first one, just really understanding it. But probably the key word there is why. Why are we doing this change? Oftentimes one that we overlook. The next one, understand the barriers to acceptance. Now, you're going to have people that don't accept it. And there's going to be barriers in the way. Some of it's people related, sometimes it's systems and process related. So understand that. Okay, what are the results, the effects of previous changes? So how has the team, again, focus on the human component, how has the team reacted or responded, I'll use my own words, to changes in the past? Are they welcomed? There are people that go, yeah, all right, let's do it. Let's make the change. I'm ready to get on board right away. There are others that perceive it as a punishment. We did something wrong and we're being punished for it. And there's people that are somewhere in the middle. So understand the previous changes that have taken place and how did people respond or react accordingly. How is your team likely to respond to the change? What you're trying to do, if you are a team leader, and even if you work in obviously a department as well, think about how people respond accordingly to change to anticipate acceptance levels. All right, our third one, communicate the change. I said this was a biggie, and it's an absolutely important one we focus a lot on. So I'll focus on the left-hand side first, and we'll talk about the cornerstone to effective changes. Engagement, absolutely critical, as much as you can. Easier said than done, but think about that engagement level. The second one there, explain what is prompting the change effort. Again, why are we doing this? People want to know. So it's not just, as I mentioned in the first one, understanding why, but we've got to communicate the why as well. And oftentimes we'll see that maybe senior managers understand the why, but they haven't communicated it effectively to everyone in the organization. The third bullet point there on the left, what formats will you use to communicate and how often? I was on a call very recently and they talked about communication and talked about it from a senior management team. And they said, we're doing some updates about every quarter. And I said, that's not enough. And people need to know how often it's happening. So how are you communicating? What's the regularity of what you're communicating? What's the information you're communicating? All of that needs to be tied into that communication plan. And how we articulate the vision for the change stretch. So what's the vision? What am I going to see? I used to have a gentleman that I worked with, and one of his main phrases around strategy was he said, paint me a picture of what that's going to look like. Where are we trying to get to? So build me and give me a vision of the strategy of where we're going. Some considerations under that. Who will be affected directly and indirectly? We often find that from a communication standpoint, we tend to think close to us organizationally, but we forget that maybe a partner is going to be affected. Maybe a client's going to be affected. Maybe a different location of the organization is going to be affected. So thinking about the effect directly and indirectly. How? What's the timing? And lastly, is there support available if I need it? Who do I go to with questions? So communication, absolutely critical. It's probably one of the pieces that we see could be better. I'll sort of say it that way. Okay. So back to our model for a moment. We're still on the right-hand side. Understand the change drivers. What's going on there? What's happening? When's it happening? Why is it happening? Understand the barriers to acceptance, and that's okay. That's going to happen. But let's see if we can remove some of those. Communicate the change and continue to communicate the change. So you'll see at the base here now, we get into the communication one, which we just went through, but we also get into the managing resistance. Again, I said earlier, this isn't control resistance. This isn't eliminate resistance. It's recognize that it's going to be there. How can I help manage it and shape it accordingly? So let's dive into that one a little bit more. First thing I always say around this one is it's normal. It's going to happen. We are humans. We don't necessarily like to do things differently. You've heard some of this before, but it's manage resistance. It doesn't say eliminate, it doesn't get rid of it, doesn't say pretend it's not there. It's manage it a little bit. Okay. There's going to be active and passive resistance. Understand what those look like. How does that come through? And who might exhibit those behaviors, if you will. Establish an environment of transparency and authenticity. Critical. We're seeing a lot of factors around trust when it comes to change management and the role that it plays. So think about that. Let people know what you know and what you don't, and be real about it. And people will see right through it if you're false or fake. So think about that transparency and being authentic. Listen and observe reactions. Be careful not to judge. I often say when it comes to managing resistance, you got to go into ask mode and not tell mode. So ask questions and listen to where are people? What is the resistance? What is it they're concerned about? There could be some really valid reasons for resistance. Impacts on customers, impacts on cost, impacts on productivity. We want those things raised. So it's not always a negative in terms of some of the resistance or the questions that people will have. Address the obstacles accordingly if you're able to. Some you will be able to, some you won't. Communicate continuously and frequently. I talked about that in the last section. And ask yourselves, what behaviors will you watch for to identify resistance? And the reason I say that is because the second part there, the last piece on the screen, be aware of silence. Silence doesn't always mean I'm done, I'm out, I've checked out, I'm just going to zip it and what happens, happens. Not at all. Silence sometimes means I'm on board. I've got nothing to add and I'm just going to ride through the process. So understand and be aware of what is silence from your individuals. Again, it goes back to where is someone's readiness for change along with yourself. Okay, so all of these things that I'm talking about apply to you as an individual, as well as your team and your organization. But paying attention to that silence, what does it mean? And don't be afraid to ask. In the past, I've asked people on my team, hey, I notice you're kind of quiet when we talk about such and such. Tell me a little bit more about that. What's your thinking? And they'll let you know. But sometimes you've got to seek that out a little bit more from an individual level and ask what's behind that. Okay, so thinking about that silence piece. All right, managing resistance. One of the last pieces that we start to get to is this idea of buy-in and commitment. And one of the phrases I use around this, and I've used it for a long time, is people support what they help to create. So can I get people engaged and committed in the process, in the change? Can I do that? Or am I just telling them what to do? I'll share an example with you. This past weekend, in preparation for putting together this PowerPoint, earlier in the day, I was going to the grocery store, and I have a 10-year-old son, my youngest, and I said to him, I said, hey, buddy, you want to, come to the grocery store with me? And I got that 10-year-old look like, seriously? Like, if it doesn't involve a ball and a net or a bat or something, like, are you kidding me? Like, I really want to go to the grocery store. It wasn't quite that overt, but I think those of you who are parents in the audience, you'll understand. And so I said to him, I said, well, look, I'll tell you what, and I'm old school. I still write out a list to go to the grocery store. I said, how about you, let's put some things on there that you like. You help me, write out the list, and then we'll go. Before I knew it, we're sitting down writing out some things for the list. We go to the grocery store, we come back, the day continues on. I come back to this PowerPoint, and I get to the screen, and I thought, well, heck, there it is. There's a perfect example, again, unrelated to organizational change, but in this case, getting him involved in literally creating the grocery list gave him buy-in and commitment to come along and participate. So think about when and where you can bring people in to the change process accordingly. All right, get them involved as much as you possibly can. All right, people support what they help to create. Now, I use that analogy, and before somebody puts something in the chat, I'm not comparing any of you or your people to my 10-year-old. That is not the analogy whatsoever. It is a simple analogy to think about sometimes how you get people involved impacts their commitment or compliance level. In this case, commitment level versus compliance. So how can you get them involved? Think about that. Allow them to have a voice and some say. And again, you may not be able to accept everything, but find out what's on their mind. What tactics will you use to engage team members in decision making? Some decisions can be collaborative. They don't have to be sort of authoritative and told what to do, particularly in a long change management strategy. And how and when will you solicit feedback? What will you do? And that might be group feedback. That might be very individual feedback, but think about how do you solicit that feedback from the group, from the team, from the individuals. Our last one, and oftentimes, again, the one that's, I'll just say, overlooked, forgotten completely, is evaluate the impact. How did the change happen? How did it go? What impact did it have? Did it have the result we wanted it to have? Both on the human and the business side. So what was the business impact? People will want to know. What were the numbers? What's the data say? What was the impact to the client? How did it improve productivity? Whatever it might be. But think about sharing the impact of that change with the team. What's the human impact been? Hey, here's what we've noticed. Here's what it has resulted in. Be able to share both of those, and certainly don't overlook those. And if you can, share the impact as you go, okay? Also, think about how are you going to measure the human impact? Okay? Ask yourself, if you manage people, you work with a team, how are you going to measure that? What does that look like? And lastly, when will you share it with the team, others, the organization, etc.? So I've seen some organizations where they do evaluate the impact, but they don't tell anybody. Like, so you've done the hard work. Now you just got to let people know, hey, actually, you know what? It worked. It saved us money. It saved us time. It did this. It did that. It actually worked. Let people know there's value in that. And that might be one of the reasons why they're resisting another change. Hey, it's just another change. We don't know what happened with the other 5 that they did. Let them know. Complete that circle from the standpoint of evaluate the impact, what worked, and frankly, what didn't work as well. All right, we're coming up on time here. A few more minutes. I'll put the model back up just again so you can kind of see it in action. And again, beginning up there with understand it. What is it? Why is it happening? What are the barriers to acceptance? Communicate that change in an ongoing format. Manage the resistance. Don't try to own it. Don't try to control it. Don't try to eliminate it. It's there. What does the commitment level look like? Again, I talked a little bit about, and I didn't go into too much detail around compliance. You're going to have people that just do it. Just think, you know what, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't, so I'm just going to comply. We're trying to get people to that commitment level. And then lastly, evaluate the impact. What did it mean? What was the results? What worked? What didn't? On the left-hand side, you see a little phrase here, and I think it's really critical to think about it from a leader of change. A great change management plan is only as good as the motivation, the focus, the attitude, and the leadership of the people implementing it. So can we get leaders on board and throughout the change management process to be committed? What's their focus? What's their attitude? What's their motivation? Now, the other piece that I'll say is Motivation, focus, attitude, and leadership certainly applies to the teams that might be impacted by the change, but it's certainly led by that leader. So thinking about, again, motivation, focus, attitude, and leadership of the people implementing it. And frankly, what's the attitude behind it? You put a change in front of someone, and again, I still want people to be authentic around it, but if you begin with, oh, you're going to hate this one, guess what? They're probably going to hate that one. So think about, how do you even introduce a change to your team, to your organization, to your particular department? So two things to think about here as I kind of finish up. I always like to give people sort of an action step, like what happens next and what are some things that Jeff kind of wants to plant the seed in my head on. Where are you currently in your change management process? Again, there's plenty going on. COVID interrupted the entire world, loads of change happening. One of the ones we're seeing and hearing very frequently is this idea of where are we going to work? Some people are going to be at home, some people are going back in the office. There's a hybrid component. So where are we currently in our change management process, whatever one it might be? And yes, you may have several change processes happening at the same time. Now I've got to evaluate each one. Where's my team with each one of those? Second one, what are you doing to effectively communicate the human side of change? And frankly, challenge and push your own leadership, okay, to be communicating on a regular basis of what does that change look like and feel like. So first and foremost, where are you in the change management process? What are you doing to effectively communicate that? And then lastly, and this is probably the real kicker of this one, is how would your team answer the question? I really should say the two questions above. Where are they in the change management process? Okay, and what are they doing to effectively communicate this side of change, up, down, and sideways? So it applies to everyone. Again, we kind of made it a little bit inter-focused in terms of your own readiness for change, but it certainly applies to your team, your department, your organization as well. So with that, I'm going to take a breath. And Charlene, I'm going to open some things up. I don't know if we had some questions or anything that I think we have about 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to open it up to you and see if there's any questions that came up as we were going through.
Hi, Jeff. So I have a couple questions here that popped in to my head, and that is you went over a lot, right? And so
I did, and I'm sorry. That was a lot in 30 minutes.
No, it was great. Lots of notes here, and again, that's why these are recorded so people can come back and rewatch and take notes. So which step or area do you see people challenged with the most, or which step do you see the least success with?
I think people are challenged, and what we've seen and heard, they're challenged most by the communication one and the regularity of communication, what they communicate, how they communicate. I hate to say that, I don't think you can really over communicate during a change, but we're trying to help organizations ramp up that communication. A lot of that happened. Again, COVID was a perfect example of that. So that would be one. I think the other piece, and it's why I add in that emotional intelligence component, absolutely critical for you to have a sense of awareness of yourself and others as a change is happening. And then in terms of the other side of it, what was the second part? Which one do we see
Least success with? Which step or area do you see kind of that least success with?
Probably the last one. People tend to not evaluate, like, how did it go? And
Mhm.
so I'm left wondering, was it worth it? Was it not? Have we been working on this now for a few months and there's no reasoning behind it? That tends to be the one that just sort of falls off and is left behind. So
Mhm,
good
mhm, mhm.
question.
Understood. I thought resistance, talking about that, was going to pop in, so that's interesting. That was just my own thought that had popped
And
up.
Charlene, just a note on that. One of the reasons it didn't raise it's probably a 1B, if you will, right underneath it. But one of the reasons is because we've been shoved literally into this change process for the past, whatever, year and a half now. So partly people have just said, I'm just going to go with it. So it's not that they're not resisting, but they've just said, all right, I realize I have to deal with it, kind of a thing. So, but it's certainly top 10. Absolutely.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Perfect. We have time for another. Is there any difference in dealing with planned change versus unplanned change?
Yeah, good, very valid question. Not really. The process doesn't necessarily change. What does change is, and again, we learned a lot through this whole COVID world, is how we react, and I'll use my own phrase, how we respond to that. It's unplanned, but I've got to quickly get things organized to think about, all right, what are the pieces and parts? if I can plan it out again, I can be much more organized. I can be more involved in terms of bringing people in, those types of things. But the process itself doesn't change. The only other thing that I would say from an unplanned one is I think if it's unplanned, your emotional intelligence one has to notch up even more because people didn't expect it. Like, where did it come from? You also have to recognize if it's unplanned that you're going to have a lot less answers and be able to tell people that, hey, you know what, I don't know because this one just happened to all of us, but I'm going to do my best to find out, like, why is this happening and where are we going with this and what's the vision behind it. So it is, there's a stronger component of the unknown, but in terms of a process and sort of those 6 steps, they pretty much remain the same, but we'll have work to do because it was unplanned.
Yeah, a couple of those areas are gonna like push and pull a little bit more. As soon as you said emotional intelligence, I'm like, that's spot on because your first reaction to things is always emotional in some way. It's an emotion.
Right. Right.
So that's I love that you had mentioned that because that's gonna raise and go down as needed. So let's fit in one more, Jeff.
Sure. Sure.
Um, what do you think are the 2 or 3 most important things you do within change management?
2 or 3 most important. I would say one, and I'll back up a little bit because I really started there, is know yourself. How do you deal with change? Oftentimes we get organizations talking to us about change, and it's for my people, it's for my organization, it's for somebody else. And we're saying, wait a second, how do you deal with change? And oftentimes when I ask people that, they haven't necessarily thought about it. So that's a critical piece. Where do you sit sort of on this change continuum? So that would be one. Um, and I think the second one would just be our ability to not go into tell mode, but to really ask people, where are they? How are they doing with the change? I admittedly could be a lot better at that. It's easier to just say, okay, this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it, but stopping, backing up and saying, how are you doing with this? Where's your thought process around this particular change? So those would probably be two that I would want people to focus on a bit.
I love that you say tell mode. Things like that stick out to me, and it helps me remember these points better and more. So, thank you so much, Jeff.